Brown says, get that India. Big boy.
Call an ambulance! Maybe call a priest! Oh, what a shot! What a shot! Campbell Killer!
Hello and welcome back to a new year and a new episode of the Tip Sheet Podcast. As always, I'm your host John, also known as 4020, and joining me for the first episode in the new year is my good mate Sixties, as well as another guest who I'll let him introduce. So big fella, as always, welcome to the show. Hope the new year's been treating you well. We do have a very wintry turn of weather as we record this episode on a Wednesday night now? The week getting by me very quickly there. How you doing?
Mate, like you said, the weather is just ridiculous. Went up and watched training on Monday in insane hot weather for football, and then the last 2 days literally could have worn a jumper watching training. It's just insane. But look, nice and quiet Christmas and New Year. That's the way I like it. You mentioned that we've got someone that we're going to introduce in just a moment. That's because Clint wrapped up his regular news appearances with us for the last 2 years, and we're going to have probably a bit of a rotating cast of
excellent use of the interchange match. Yes, a very strong bench rotation here.
Yeah, that's right. So, and just before we do, mate, a reminder: no matter what platform you're listening on, if you can give a like and subscribe, that helps with all the metrics, helps to get the content out there to as many Eels supporters as we possibly can. Shout out to our sponsors, Star Partners Real Estate, Auburn, Narellan and Parramatta for their continued support, basically for the duration that TCT has existed. They've been on board with just unwavering loyalty and support. So we thank Greg and the team there. We will have another sponsor announcement very shortly, I'd say, in the next couple of weeks for 2025. And if there are other businesses out there that love their Eels and would love to jump on board with the most respected Parramatta Eels website out there, the Cumberland Throw, we'd love to hear from you. So we've got a range of sponsorship packages which should suit a range of businesses. So please get in touch with us. And John, without further ado, I'd like to throw over to Chris Ricketts. Chris has actually already been part of the Cumberland Throw with his Off the Cumberland Fence articles, which started probably, what was it, Chris? Late November, I think?
Yeah, thereabouts. I think it coincided with Gutho formally being announced to leave the club. So it's been a privilege to write them. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe early November. So, Chris, welcome to the Cumberland Throw.
Thanks, gents. It's a pleasure to be here. Long-time listener, and I've always enjoyed getting the news from you guys. So a real privilege to be part of the show and looking forward to catching up.
And, these dulcet tones, they sound like they've been on a podcast or two in their time, in its time. Your voice, mate, is you have a bit of a podcast that you want to give a plug to?
I do. It's a little bit different to the type of podcast we're on now, but a couple of mates and I have a podcast called Put a Line Through 'em. It's definitely a bit more of an offbeat look at rugby league, and it's not necessarily Parramatta-centric, but it's a way for me to keep in touch with my friends back home, so I enjoy doing it.
That's awesome. Yeah.
And let's get into that, because you are based overseas, aren't you?
I've lived overseas since 2016, and I was a long-time Parramatta fan, well, basically a lifetime Parramatta fan. I kept my Parramatta season tickets up until only around COVID, so I had them for a long time and just wasn't using them. I live currently in Europe, in Austria, in Salzburg, actually, and prior to that, I'd lived in Chicago in the US. So there's always a bit of finagling that needs to go on with my calendar to make sure I can watch all the games, but I am typically fairly successful at that.
And what's it like living in Austria, mate?
It's different. My German's not too crash hot, and their love of rugby league is as pronounced as it is in the Golden West. But I enjoy looking out the window, and there's mountains everywhere. And at the moment, there's snow everywhere. I've become reasonably proficient at skiing, reasonably unproficient at speaking German. And overall, it's a good experience. My kids speak fluent German now, which is great. And it's definitely, I say, broadened my worldview.
And something that I remember you letting me know about very early on was your jersey collection. Can you fill our listeners in on how extensive it is?
Yeah, it's fairly extensive. I've collected jerseys since I was a kid. I think the first one I got would have been a 1989 Hardyplex from my grandparents or something like that. I would say I would have probably 1,200 jerseys in total, of which maybe 400 odd are rugby league, of which maybe 150 are Parramatta, and that's not including jackets and various other bits of paraphernalia, jackets, t-shirts, whatever else. It's my wife is a very, very patient lady for many reasons.
Usually you have the big closet and you think it'd be all for the missus, right? But in this case, it's for the jerseys, which naturally we're just too. What's your favourite Eels kit then? With all the 150-odd jerseys you've got, best kit in your opinion?
What's my favourite or what's my most valuable? I might answer both there. The most valuable, I'm just going to have a shout out to a friend of mine who also has a podcast, a guy named Troy Warner, probably famous for the Para Cave. He actually helped me get the connection with Troy Campbell, former Parramatta player, where I picked up his M&M jersey from the 1997 game against Manly. So those are some of the most rare, for any Parramatta collector, those are the rarest jerseys out there. In terms of which are my favourite ever, I've got a real soft spot for the late 90s Asics away kits, or the yellow ones.
Yep.
So 98 and 99, those cotton ones, just before the cotton ended. The poly jerseys for me almost shape as a necessity. With someone with my jersey habit, I kind of feel like I need to buy them, but I would typically wear cotton if I'm ever at a game or anything else.
Yeah, you're a man after my own heart too, mate. I prefer wearing the cotton jersey. So I've got the 86 retro cotton jersey that I wear to the games. It's my go-to. It's comfortable. It's I don't have to worry about it clinging to every inch of my rather large frame at the games. And you know what? Because they've got that room with being cotton, you can wear a t-shirt or something underneath in winter just to add a little bit of extra warmth, a layer of warmth at the nighttime game. So, yeah, I love the cotton jerseys. You've already written an article for us on the new jerseys, but I don't think it came out at the time that there is an all gold kit that the Eels could be wearing this year. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I actually really like it. And look, I mean, at its core, assessing jerseys is a very subjective thing. So there is no right or wrong answer. And I'll just say that now because I know that some people will be sitting there saying, well, I hate it or I love it. Ultimately, this is purely at your own discretion. For me, I think anything that makes us stand out is a good thing. Anything that looks slightly different on the field, I'm totally in line with that. I mean, I'm probably in the minority in that I really like the 2022 Anzac jersey, which was the poppies and things all over it. A lot of people thought that was too busy. So I think with regards to the bananas in pajamas look that we're going to be rocking at our away games this year, I'm totally on board with it, and I think it looks fantastic. Watching Fox get around, and I think he's going to be scorching the length of the field for a few tries in that kit.
Yeah, you know what? If it becomes a winning jersey, it'll become a popular jersey regardless. But I've loved going back and finding some of the photos from I think it was the 77 pre-season when we also rocked an all gold outfit with the gold jersey, the gold shorts, the gold socks. And there's some great photos there with a Ray Price, although that photo I found was a black and white one. but Ray Price, Mick Cronin, and the Emperor himself, Dennis Fitzgerald, in the all-gold kit. So, it'll be interesting this year. But, fellas, I think it's probably time for us to hit the news.
News team, assemble!
Well, fellas, the big news, of course, this week was that training has resumed for the 2025 pre-season. The Eels were back at work on Monday. I mentioned before it was a hell of a day to start. The heat was quite intense, and the players kicked it off with the old Broncos test. You get 2 weeks off, and you've got to make sure you keep the fitness up, because the coaching staff, they're putting the test on first day back for those players. And I'm happy to report that without getting any official times or anything like that, that it all looked like it went quite well. And I did report that there was a record broken, that Riley Smith, the rising young dummy half, broke the club record for the Broncos test. Now, I'm not going to reveal what his time was, because that sort of stuff, I figure that's all in club stuff, and if the club want to ever talk about it, then that's fine. But of course, it was beating a record held by King Gutho himself. So I think the young Riley can be very, very pleased with what he's achieved, because I believe he got to within a second of that time at the start of the pre-season, and now he's moved past Gutho's previous record time. So well done to him. And fellas, I thought that right now, rather than me going into some of the stuff that's in there in the training reports themselves, I wanted to throw a question to both of you, which is, out of the new players in the team this year, or potentially in the team this year, certainly the players who are in the squad now, whether they're a new addition to the club or whether they're someone that's coming up through pathways, who is the player that you're either most interested in watching this year, or that you think will make the biggest difference to the team this year? Maybe that's two separate questions. You might want to answer, give two different answers. So, John, I'm going to throw to you first. Who is that player?
I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Sort of the whiplash and the juxtaposition coming in from last year, where we had such a small recruitment class that was Kelma Tuolangi and Morgan Harper, to what we have this year, where if you're looking across both the NRL and New South Wales Cup rosters, we've added nearly double-digit players that could all make a difference at those two respective levels. Oh, in terms of who's going to make the biggest difference to the first grade team, I don't know the right answer here, mate. Isaiah Iongi comes in taking a place in the spines. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of both expectation and opportunity for him to perform. You bring in one of the biggest representative stars that was signed in modern history in Zac Lomax, who brings just a huge pedigree to the back line. The Fox gives you speed and experience. You've got probably an underrated pickup there in the back row in Jack Williams. So maybe in lieu of those flashy backs, I'll probably put my hat in the ring for Jack Williams, because I think that Iongi, Lomax, and the Fox, or just, well, especially with the Fox and Lomax, give you immediate, obvious contributions, and yes, they're going to improve the back line immensely. Iongi comes with a lot of pedigree from the Penrith pathways and is going to have that opportunity in a position that touches the ball a lot, in a structure that we know with Mitchell Moses and Dylan Brown is going to give him opportunities to attack the edges downhill. Our back row, though, maybe Williams can give us something there that I think could be pretty handy. And I know that the knock on him was some handling errors, and that's not a unique criticism of players, but I think he's going to bring a really high standard to the back row and maybe just juice us up a bit in a position where we haven't been bad, but we probably haven't been dominant. So I'm hoping that Jack Williams can be that guy.
It's interesting that you mentioned Jack Williams. He certainly is on my list, but I should mention as well that when they did the Broncos test, they ran it for the backs and threw Riley Smith in with the backs. But when they ran it for the forwards, it was a battle royal between Jack Williams and Dan Keir for who finished first. And I think Jack Williams might have edged Dan out by 1 second on their Broncos run. So
You got to love that from Keir too, don't you, 60s? That he got a taste of first grade last year and is clearly not taking it for granted and has come back hungry. So good stuff.
Oh, look, he's always had a great work ethic, Dan. And, there's a lot of competition for places. Some of the critics talk about Parramatta having a lack of depth in the forwards. I don't know that there's a lack of depth. I think
it's the opposite. If you look at the cup list, it is a nightmare trying to make the cup team for the good reason.
Absolutely. There will be players who will miss out on the cup team that shouldn't be, that should actually be in contention at the very least for maybe an interchange spot with the NRL team. So that's how tough things are going to be. But I did want to mention Jack Williams because the other side of it is, in credit to him, that he wasn't in full training. He'd been in rehab as well at the start of the preseason with I think he had a broken arm from memory. His arm was in a cast at the start of the preseason. So that's a big effort from him. So he certainly turned up ready to go. And when they did a bit of media with the players and they had to give one word to sum up what 2025 meant to them, Jack Williams chose the word opportunity. And you get the sense that he's primed himself to take the best possible, to give himself the best possible opportunity to succeed at the Eels. Chris, what about you? Who is either the player or the players that you'd like to nominate?
Yeah, so I think John stole my thunder a little bit there because Jack Williams was who I was going to say, but I'll just add one thing there to say in recent years, Parramatta has a great history of finding undervalued or underappreciated back rowers. If you look at Isaiah Papali'i or recently Jermaine Hopgood or even Kelma Tuolangi last year. So Jack Williams could very much be in that mold, and that's where I was kind of looking at in terms of this could be, once again, a best case scenario here is you find a representative quality player at unders, and that's how you can form a good squad. But I'll just add a couple of other players then just to add to the conversation. And it's a couple of guys that would have most likely played several first-grade games for us last year, if not for season-ending injuries. So that's Arthur Miller-Stevens and also Richard Penasini. And I'm curious to see, one of the big knocks on Parramatta last year and indeed the year before that was a lack of depth in our outside backs. This year we appear to be injury-free, and I think some of these young kids, if we're a development club, I'm interested to see what some of these kids can do as they come through into first grade if they get given an opportunity. I know they'll likely be behind Fox and Lomax and guys like that to begin with, but I'm curious to see what some of these 21, 22-year-old guys can do given the opportunity in first grade.
Yeah, look, I think there'll be some genuine competition for places in that New South Wales Cup team because as far as outside backs are concerned, you can throw in Jordan Samrani, who we also picked up from the Dogs. There's a bit of a rumour floating around about Eli Clark, who the Dogs have apparently let go, that the Eels were looking to add him to their backline depth. I believe he's a centre there. Then you've also got Ethan Martin, who came back to pre-season training on Monday. He was there at the start of the pre-season but had a bit of a shoulder issue. And so rather than having him using up his NRL pre-season contract time, so that players who are not on development squad or in NRL, they might have a lower level contract, but part of that contract is part of what's written into the contract is doing a certain amount of an NRL pre-season. It might be 6 weeks prior to Christmas. It might be the entire pre-season. So he, rather than spending that time in rehab before Christmas, they sent him away and to come back when his shoulder was a little bit better. So he came back this week. He's a real diamond in the rough, Ethan. How that translates this season will be interesting, because he was another who had injury problems last year. And just as he was starting to make an impact in New South Wales Cup and getting on the try scorers list on a regular basis and scoring some tries that, John, as you know, there were tries that he scores that very few players can score.
He was electric with the ball in hand, and there was a couple of players, including himself, Tony Mattielli, just guys that have the talent, just were so disrupted by injuries last year that you want to see stay healthy just so they can compete, because they've got the talent. So he's definitely the head of that list, though, isn't he? He is electric with the ball in hand. He's got that short area speed that you don't see in too many players. So keep him healthy and he'll be right in the mix.
Yeah, so for me, it's trying to narrow it down. I mean, I'm there formulating the question that I threw out to both of you, and it's a question that I find near impossible to answer myself. But
because,
sorry, John.
I was going to say the inverse of that question is also super difficult, because internally, who's going to add the most to the Eels with the change of coaching regime and just the way that the Eels are going to be shaken up? Because there's a number of players in that starting roster that could have their output change phenomenally based on how they're used.
Well, let's fly with that on the run, and I'll give my answer to my own question first of all, and then I'll throw your question back to you and Chris straight after that, John. So for me, look, it's, as I said, there's so many players. Look, I think the player that I'm most interested in seeing, I'm going to go the same as both of you. I'm very interested in seeing what Jack Williams brings to the team. And from as far as the player that I think will have the greatest impact, I mean, it's hard to go past Zac Lomax for a start.
Just the prototypical outside back.
And just seeing the difference with that seems to be there with Isaiah Iongi, just the speed at which he injects himself into the shapes that they're working on. That's something else. But, mate, it's hard to go past what I've seen at training. The Fox, like the Fox is just, it's just what he brings in terms of the vibe and the energy to the squad. It's it makes a big difference, and just his talk out on the field, like he literally doesn't shut up to the people who are inside him.
Which every good winger, that's one of their calling cards, isn't it? They just keep talking and talking, both in offense and defense.
Yeah, and you have to think to yourself that I don't know that Micah was that big a talker.
No.
Out on the field, and I can just see that the Fox being beside Will Penasini and also being on the same side as Dylan Brown, he's already doing a lot of talk at training with Dylan. Like he's calling out to him constantly about, and in both attack and defence. Like he's barking at him in with defence as well. So I think he could be someone that makes a massive difference, and that's even ignoring just that the pace that he has, the like of which we haven't had at the club. Like that's just
Since semi, probably.
I can't ever think of having someone that fast.
Yeah, semi wasn't even like out and out speed, but he was just semi. So we haven't had a pure speedster in a long, long time because Luke Burt was quick, but he wasn't a speedster, right? And
No.
Ryan might be the last.
Sorry, who was that?
Leo Ryan might be the last.
Oh yeah.
Geez, that's a going a fair way back, isn't it? Because we've had like pretty balanced wingers for a long time. Like going back to when we were strong in the 2000s. From the late 2000s, where we had guys like Chris Ricketts and whatnot, who again were very powerful and balanced athletes, but not out and out speedsters. Eric Grove Jr. Again, he was quick but not a speedster. So yeah, there's
Hayne.
Hayne was just like the perfect athlete in that regard. So he's probably like the cheat code, and obviously went on to be more of a fullback than a winger. But yeah, he was definitely a speedster. So it's a different dynamic 60s, and that different dynamics. Why I think it's going to be a different player that probably makes the big jump internally for us. And I'm going to cheat because I think it's two players. One that we mentioned was a recruit last year in Kelma Tuolangi, who I think is primed to build on what he showed last year before injuries and suspension slowed him down. I think he could be a huge breakout candidate in Jason Riles' structures. But more than anyone, I think when you talk about what Isaiah Iongi's bringing with that downhill speed, when you talk about the communication and the speed of the Fox on the left flank, and then you look at that sort of thunder and lightning component with Will Penasini there, where he is the thunder and the Fox is lightning. I think Dylan Brown, if he stays healthy, obviously that ACL is a real concern, that partial tear that you just have to ride out now. If he stays healthy, he is just set up for a monster year. We've spoken about so many times about the half breaks he creates and all the opportunities that he just so frustratingly looks to create that these teammates haven't capitalised on. And I think bringing someone like Iongi in, who plays different from Gufferson, and again, it's not a knock on Guffer, who was just a line up for this team, but Iongi's probably going to have a different mandate to play off of his two halves rather than with his two halves as a tertiary playmaker. And I think that's probably going to unlock someone like Dylan Brown a lot next season, this year. We're in that awkward transitional period, my bad.
Well, I'm about to throw to Chris for his take on that, but I'm going to give you another name from the past with that fastest winger, Shane Werrett.
Oh, yeah.
He was probably professional sprint level in terms of his pace. But so Chris, who's an incumbent player that you think will be a major contributor to this year?
It's going to sound like an obvious answer, but it's really going to expand upon John's point in terms of Mitchell Moses only played 8 games for us last year. And so ultimately he's going to be given more of a leadership role this year from Riles. Whether or not that manifests itself in the captain's armband, yet to be seen, but he's going to be definitely on-field leader. We saw with Dylan last year, he was playing a role that wasn't best suited to him. I think the best he looked was when we had Ethan Sanders for a few games playing the organising role, and Dylan could play off him. So when Dylan has to play at 7 and has to organise, that's not the role he's best suited to. So I think if we get a full year out of Moses, he is obviously the most important player to the team. There's nothing too outlandish about that statement. But I think if we get a full year out of Mitch, he most likely won't be kicking goals, I wouldn't imagine, behind Lomax. He will be given the keys to the team in attack. I'm curious to see what that does to unlock everybody, including Iongi and Dylan, as you mentioned, John. So Mitch Moses for mine.
Yeah, good call, because obviously I think our finals aspirations probably ride or die on the health of Mitchell Moses. And if he does go down for a shorter period, I think the talent's there to absorb the pressure. But he is a true superstar. And one of the metrics you talk about with superstars is, can they elevate the players around them? And Mitchell absolutely falls in that category. So if he is healthy, I think that our season is set up to be one that will probably upset a lot of pundits who, as we're talking about in the green room pre-recording, there's a lot of talk about the Eels for the spoon in certain branches of the media. I think that Mitch stays healthy and then so much falls into place for this team.
It's going to be just my first answer to this is Dylan Brown, for all the reasons that you spoke about, John. And he really looks like a switched-on player at training, and there's already elements to his game that I think he's added in the short period of time. But I want to steer away from a couple of those players just to add a bit of variety to the opinion. And I'm gonna nominate Junior.
Strip down.
And the reason I'm going to nominate Junior is that Junior is currently the leanest that I've ever seen him. He's currently weighing in at 111 kilos. Now, will he play at that or lighter? I don't know. They might want him to put on a couple of kilos and play around 114, 115 kgs. But I think he's got a new lease of life. And like Moses and Hopgood, he was out for an extended period of time last year. And we saw Reg rise to the occasion during 2024 with the absence of his big name prop compatriot. But yeah, I'll nominate Junior to have a big season in 2025 and to be a really important figure in an Eels pack which has copped a lot of criticism and I think is massively underrated. So, and now let's skip ahead to what we had planned to talk about towards the end of our Eels news, which is the season previews that you just referenced, John, where there's a lot of tipsters that are including the Eels in spoon discussions. Would you like to give your thoughts on that?
I kind of understand why. Obviously, engagement drives a lot of his stuff for the digital media and predicting teams like South Sydney, Parramatta, Canterbury that have very active, vocal, mobile, online fan bases. You want to give them really high, really low sort of aspirational evaluations to drive engagement. So I'm not surprised to see Parramatta featuring low in a lot of things, but the wooden spoon is kind of wild, isn't it? Like you look at, I know the West Tigers have recruited strongly. It's not the first year they've recruited strongly during their reign of back-to-back spoons. So, like, surely the incumbents deserve favouritism there. So it's it's just funny that the Eels sort of been hit with the tag of spoon favourites, and we could realistically be in the bottom quadrant of the ladder if things go wrong with injuries and suspensions, and things don't quite click early on, and you get yourself in a hole. We've seen it before, and that is certainly a possibility. But by the metric literally mentioned before by Chris with the injury to Mitchell Moses, the Eels were plagued by injuries in season 2024. They had their coach, sent packing halfway through the season, and they still avoided the spoon by, in the end, 2 spots, funnily enough, in the last round. So if we couldn't get the spoon that season, I think it's a relative long shot that we should be considered to be strongly in contention for it. I think obviously we're going to be looking at this as a glass half full and very optimistic, but I do think there are legitimate grounds to be quite optimistic about Parramatta's upcoming season. I think the return of key personnel from those long-term injuries, we mentioned Mitchell Moses, but Junior Barlaw, Bailey Simonson will be back helping that back line as well. I'm sure there's a couple other guys I'm missing. Jermaine Hopgood, literally origin player for the Eels. So pretty handy player there. I think we're in a good position, and perhaps more so than any recent year, there's going to be a hunger in this team just because of the way things are played out. It's a new coach, there's a lot of new signings, big shake-up of the squad from top to bottom, from coach to players. I think there's going to be a real hunger in the house and a chance to go out there and prove themselves to the entire competition. So I understand why we're being put down low, both on just a performance level and also an engagement thing. But it would be nice to see, and you talk about our internal sort of evaluation 60s. We're not saying minor premiership top 4, but we think that we're a legitimate top 8 contend, or at least in the hunt for the contention of the top 8. And I don't think that's an unreasonable assertion.
And Out of interest, who is your tip for the Spoon?
Oh, look, again, it feels mean to pick on the Tigers, and they have had a very good recruitment drive. They've also lost Stefano Utoikamanu, who is one of their best players, and obviously replaced him with Terrell May, who's going to, on paper, be a great pickup. I do think the Tigers probably are favourites until they aren't, until they literally prove it not. But just looking at the ladder, I don't know, it's the Titans, the Warriors, the Dragons, who are very gutsy, but they've struggled for recruitment. I don't think the Dragons are probably a realistic bet, but the Rabbitohs have got Wayne back. Surely he improves them, and they had a lot of injuries like the Eels, so they're probably not in the mix. But you can probably take a pick out of some of those teams I mentioned there. There's usually one team that crashes outside the top 8 every year as well. I tipped that to be Newcastle coming into last year, but they actually rallied late season to put themselves back into the 8. So I don't know. I just think it's got to be the Tigers until it isn't the Tigers, which I know is picking on them, but they've got the form across 3 years now.
Yep. Okay. Well, Chris, same
Yes.
questions to you. What's your take on some of these previews that have been out there? We were talking in the green room earlier about the more positive one that's just appeared in the Telegraph through Adam Mobbs, that potentially that he sees the potential for Eels to be in finals football. But how have you seen some of the previews, and how do you think we're going to go?
Well, I think I think John put it quite eloquently in terms of, if I think to some of those Fox League, for instance, predictions, you do see clubs like South's being predicted to come top 4, Parramatta to get the Spoon. So there's a very clear drive there to drive engagement. In terms of curbing expectation, I think, I think that doesn't do anything but motivate players and fans. So from my perspective, if there are some of these muckrakers out there suggesting that Parramatta is going to win the Spoon, I'm more than happy with it. I think if I had to pick who is actually going to win the Spoon, I don't think John mentioned this team, but this is the team that I think is a very realistic chance of winning the Spoon, and that's the Dolphins. We've seen this Wayne Bennett curse, if you will, many times in the past, where Wayne kind of leaves the club, and whether it's his fault or not, or it's some other factor there, that particular club will fall off a cliff. So I say this with no real joy, because I've enjoyed what the Dolphins have brought to the comp over the last few years, but I think Redcliffe might be a big shot at the Spoon. It would bring me joy to see the Tigers win it again, but
You make a great point, though. I spoke about the positive impact that Wayne Bennett could have at South Sydney without even considering that they're going to a rookie coach now. And I know he's been a long time understudy of Wayne Bennett in Christian Wolf, right? That's who's taken over at the Dolphins.
But we saw that with Demetrio as well.
Exactly. You can be anointed as the next big thing and the career understudy of a great coach like Wayne Bennett, but taking over the reins, it's big time, and there's so many more responsibilities that go from being an assistant coach to being the man at the top when it comes to managing the roster on and off the field, and it's not an easy jump. So, yeah, Dolphins are a very good shout. They've been very plucky under Wayne Bennett, which is one of the characteristics of his coaching style, where he gets the most out of a lot of fringe players. Can Wolf maintain that sort of rage? It's going to be interesting to see. So, a good pick there for the Spoon.
Yeah, fins down.
Yeah, I see, first of all, I see the Eels as being definite improvers. How much improvement, that obviously remains to be seen, but I don't see anything but improvement happening, because John already referenced the injury toll. We missed something like 140 games from our top 30 players last year. 140 games. It was the equivalent, basically, of losing 6 players for a season.
Crazy.
That sort of number.
Yeah.
And considering that we only had 28 players.
Yeah, it wasn't a full top 30 either. So you're comparatively getting hurt even more. It's a big toll that we lost.
Technically, we did have a top 30 because we had players who were signed into the top 30 that made up 30, but they were released before the season began. But given that they were actually on the Eels roster from the time that the roster signings start getting counted, which is basically the start of November, we had 30 players in the season registered to the Eels. But yeah, once you start talking about 28 players effectively in the top 30 and 6 players essentially being missing for the entire season, and that key players like our only 2 Origin players play Origin, get injured, out for the rest of the year. I mean, who else but Parramatta would have an outcome like that?
Impressively bad luck, isn't it?
Oh, it was insane. So, and then, of course, everything else that went on around it with the coaching situation, etc. So, look, we know that there were some bad times last year, but we also know that it was a perfect storm in terms of things being in a situation where they can go wrong. So, yeah, improvement. I've still got a broad range of spots where I think Parramatta can finish up. Somewhere between 6th and 12th is my broad range right now. I need to see a little bit more before I start to get a little bit more specific. As far as the spoon is concerned, I think that's a great call about the Dolphins. And you know what? I'm going to throw the Knights in with the mix. I've got a feeling that there might be a parting of the ways with the coach this year.
Yep.
And if that happens mid-season, well, we saw what happened with Power and South in 24. So, you just feel, don't you, like every year, like the Knights are just a small step away from complete implosion.
Been on a knife's edge for a number of seasons, haven't they? With
Yeah.
the will they were, weren't they, of Adam O'Brien, and he got a bit of job security when they stormed into the finals 2 years ago, and then again this season just passed. They squeak their way in there, but they're complete also-rans in the context of the premiership. They've got big roster gaps that are going to be difficult to deal with, and it just feels like the implosion is just waiting to happen. And to their credit, they've managed to pull through the last couple of years, but they've just lost. We'll talk about it shortly, but they've lost another big-time player that they've developed, and it's going to be very frustrating for them, and that adds more pressure, doesn't it, internally?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd just say hitching your wagon to Kalen Ponga's injury, being injury-free, it feels very, very shaky to me. And the Knights have had several years to build around Ponga, and they've never been able to get a 6 or 7 of any note. They continue to go for journeymen and those sort of things. So I'd say that's an excellent shout.
Doesn't that remind you of a club that we know pretty in-depth about having a superstar fullback that you just can't figure out the rest of the roster with? And it's got to be one of the most frustrating formulas to get wrong in the NRL, isn't it?
Yeah. And, when you know that particular player eats up so much of the cap as well and dictates to an extent decisions that are made at the club. So, yeah, interesting times. But moving ahead to wrap up the Eels news, I just want to mention, fellas, that it's that time of year where junior rep season is almost upon us. And the Eels had some trial games against the Raiders just before Christmas. And that was like a genuine hit out where a lot of players who were part of their summer training squads got a run against the Raiders. They have trimmed the squads down a little bit. They still have to be trimmed a little bit more, I believe. And they've got 2 trials to work that out. I reckon they'll probably do the final trimming before the final trial. So maybe this weekend's trial is going to be the most important from that regard. Anyway, they're taking on the old enemy in the Bulldogs out at Eric Tweedale Stadium on Friday night and Saturday night. So the girls' teams are in action Friday night and the boys' teams are in action on Saturday night. And I think we've got kickoffs at 5:30 and 7:30. So let me just double check. No, it's Friday night. It's 6 p.m. for the Lisa Fiaola and 7:30 for the Tarsha Gale. And on Saturday, it's 5:30 p.m. for the Mats and 7:30 p.m. for the Ball. So if you'd like to get out there, catch a bit of the action, catch maybe some new faces, because there's always new faces with the younger teams, and see how they're shaping up for this year. Fellas, I got down to Kellyville on Saturday last week and watched the Mats and Ball go through an extensive training session on the Kellyville fields. It's not their normal ground that they train on, but they did. I think they might have ended up being a full day that they did there on Saturday. But I caught the field session. I'd be very surprised if they're not one of the fittest. Both of the teams are not close to the fittest in their respective competitions. I haven't been able to catch the girls' teams train as yet, but those boys' teams, they certainly looked super fit. So, and not only that, man, there's some big units for young kids as well.
Yeah.
So, that's all I have to say there. John, it's just about that time for you to do your stuff.
Yeah, we enter the year 2025, which in terms of pop culture immediately made me think of Futurama and a specific episode where they have to travel forward in time to get back in time, and the accompanying song that went with it. So this is the Futurama time travel song.
In the year 105, if man is still alive, if the robot can survive, they may find. In the year 25, the backwards time machine still won't have arrived. In all the world, there's only one technology, a rusty sword for practicing proctology. In the future year that ends with a 20, a schlubby merman's gonna try to get chummy. He may look like a watery wimp, when in fact he's a bloodthirsty shrimp. In the year 1.5 million, humankind is enslaved by giraffe. Man must pay for all his misdeeds when the treetops are stripped of their leaves. Whoa.
So thankfully it isn't the year 25. We don't have to worry about proctology being practiced by swords. But yeah, the year 2025 and Futurama, and that's the connection this year.
Oh, brilliant choice, mate. They're well sourced. Well, fellas, it feels like the NRL news is a Bulldog special this week, because it's just one story after another that feature the Bulldogs. And first, for positive news for them, is that they've signed Leo Thompson for the 2026 season onwards. John, what's your take on that?
I mean, look, in a surface level, it's a good pickup. Leo Thompson's been a genuine breakout player for the Newcastle Knights across the last 2 seasons. What I did find was very amusing in the entire process leading up to it was that there was good mail at one point that the Canberra Raiders had sealed a deal and had signed Leo Thompson. And at that point, Canterbury fans just would have gone, he was overrated, would have paid too much for him, could have got better value elsewhere. And then when obviously the news changed, the tone changed very quickly too, and the 180 happened, and suddenly, great player, great pickup, which it is. But the value is fantastic, which I'm not sure it is, because we'll talk about that shortly. But that's not just true to only Canterbury fans. Every club's fans are guilty of that, aren't they? When they sort of justify themselves why missing out a player was okay, and then why getting that same player might be the best thing since sliced bread. So always funny to see it play out in a different crew though, and the Canterbury fans were certainly guilty of that in the process here. They desperately need middle forward 60s. They've been in the market for a while. Missed out on a couple of guys. Most notably, probably Stefano Utoikamanu went to Melbourne, and that would have been a huge one for them to get. So they get a pretty good player in Leo Thompson. But the figure of, I think Canberra had offered him $875K per, and the media report I saw was $825K per for the Dogs. That's big money. Like he's got to be very, very good for them to justify the full weight of that contract. He is a player on the ascent, but you're talking genuine elite middle money there at 800 plus.
Yeah, Chris, is this a good pickup for the Dogs?
I think, Gus has had this pursuit for middle for a long time. Takiaho famously was signed and then didn't pass an injury report. I think it's a good signing. I'll just say one thing about the Dogs. In most businesses, you would look for, somewhere around maybe 10% churn every year. In rugby league terms, it's obviously going to be higher than that with the nature of the game. But I feel like at the Dogs, they must turn over about 40% of their roster every year. Gus's acrobatics with salary cap management and roster management are something incredible to see. I mean, we're going to talk a lot about various Dogs players, either past, present, or future, tonight. And his ability to kind of get rid of guys, add guys, bring in guys is maybe unparalleled, but it seems like he's landed this man. I think it's big money, but he certainly has been a very good player over the last couple of years. If he continues that trajectory, then it'll be money well spent.
Yeah, Gus is certainly the magician, I think. He's a manager, a team manager, a football manager who is able to sign players or seems to sign players and then work out how to make it fit later. And I would assume that he has very good relationships with player managers, the player agents, because the players that they need to move on seem able to find another home fairly seamlessly. And I guess this is the advantage that he would have for all those years that he's been in the game and the high profile that he has and how well regarded he is by player agents. So I guess in one sense, more power to him. But, there's always something that's just a little bit on the nose when you see them pick up a player on really big money and then you go, well, how do they make it fit? Well, eventually they do make it fit, but you just wonder how they can be in the market for some players at certain times. But, John, it looks like there will be a fairly immediate cost for them in terms of players, even though Thompson's not due to... Let me just throw this question to you both. Thompson's not due to start till 2026. Will there be any play to get him to the Bulldogs before then?
Oh, you know they will. Just you don't sign players over 12 months out from a new contract and then not make the play. It's just a standard gambit now in the NRL is to push for that transfer a year ahead of a contract being lodged for a different club. So I would be stunned given that they have a pressing need for players in the middle to make an impact. And while premiership windows are so volatile, and you can certainly make a strong argument as to whether the Dogs are in a premiership window or not. They made their first finals in just about a decade and dropped out to Manly in the first week. So if they're a team on the ascent, and internally they probably think they're going to be pushing because you never know when that window is going to snap shut. So delaying it by 12 months could be massively detrimental. So I expect them to be pushing aggressively, and especially if Newcastle fall off, which is obviously, as we just discussed, a possibility.
Well, Chris, I see this, any potential move around Leo Thompson for the 25 season as being quite significant for two reasons. First, if he departs Newcastle, they move closer to a lock-in for the spoon, in my opinion. If not just for the loss of his playing talent, but I just think when you get a player that might potentially be dissatisfied or might be agitating for an early move, I think that has a disruptive effect on the team. But the other thing too is I don't have a high regard for the Dogs, and I didn't see them making the finals this year. I think they were the team that flew under the radar in 24. and I think their exit from finals football was more indicative of the team that they are. However, I think if they pick up Leo Thompson early in 25, I think they could make the finals again. What's your thoughts on him potentially arriving at the Dogs early?
Well, I think there's a few moving pieces here. So, I mean, with reference to how the Dogs might potentially travel this year, ultimately they still have Connor Tracy at 1 and Toby Sexton at 7. I'm not sure that's a premiership winning spine. Matt Burton's obviously an excellent player, and Reid Marnie, whilst I liked him much more when he was at Parramatta, is undoubtedly a very good player. But I don't see Sexton and Connor Tracy leading you to a premiership, regardless of who your middle is. I just don't see that happening. The flow-on effect would also be that if the Knights do start badly and they do release someone like Leo Thompson, it could also finally jolt Jaden Brayley free as well, which I know Parramatta have been rumoured to be sniffing around. Whether or not that's actually close to happening at this point, I'm unsure, but that could also have another impact there. I definitely think Gus will be doing everything in his power to get Leo Thompson over early. As to what impact that would have on the competition more broadly, I don't necessarily think it puts them in the premiership conversation.
Yeah, and I guess that's I think that's probably a common sense answer as well that you've given there, Chris. And let's now talk about the fallout that could come from quite soon from the Bulldogs recruitment. And John, that's a talented young halves player who looks like he's on the move.
Yeah, well, they recruited Karl Oloapu from the Broncos with much fanfare when he was under contract at the, I was about to say the Redcliffe franchise, but then not the Redcliffe franchise anymore, the Brisbane franchise there. When they got him to play, come to them on considerable money and play, whether it was halves or at lock forward for him, and then obviously he got injured, hurt his neck and had his future under something of a cloud. Well, he's been medically cleared and is intending to resume playing, and now he's been linked to the Dolphins and a return back to the Sunshine State and indeed Brisbane as part of that, I suppose, the periphery of what's happening with the Leo Thompson stuff. So it's a bit of a cautionary tale, isn't it? And we talked about that roster volatility and the churn. Clubs like the Roosters and the Bulldogs, if you're a player signing for them, you have to bear that in mind, don't you? Especially as a young guy who hasn't established themselves and might have less opportunities elsewhere if things go awry. Taking the big paycheck from the big club isn't always great for you long term. And we've seen it with the Roosters in the past. Josh Curran, who was a Parramatta junior, ended up getting cut mid-contract and went to New Zealand before finding his way to the Bulldogs, funnily enough. But yeah, you got a player here in Karl Oloapu who could be on the move, and it wasn't that long ago that he was being hailed as the next great thing for the Bulldogs. So a lot of moving parts, a lot of moving pieces, and the Dogs continue to churn. And you can't fault them not turning over every stone, trying to make themselves competitive. It's just more on the other side of things for the players, just to keep your wits about you when you go into negotiations. Yeah,
absolutely. There was who was the I'm trying to remember his name, Michael Jabril.
Yes,
Michael
yeah,
Jabril.
who was the Dogs poached him as a Harold Matts player from us, very talented player. We were fuming that we'd lost him, but he was then flipped over without a second thought in the Connor Tracy acquisition to Cronulla, and now he's in Cronulla's pathway. So just, again, just because you sign a big deal with one of these clubs like the Roosters or the Dogs, and they're not the parties that do it, but they are two of the more prolific. Just a reminder that you might not be there for that long.
Yeah, Chris, gone are the days where talented young players might bide their time behind any star players who are just in front of them in a particular club. If they see something that blocks them from getting to first grade as quickly as possible, they're out of there more often than not.
Yeah, and that's modern rugby league, isn't it? I think we had an example last year within our club with Ethan Sanders where there was no real clear opportunity for him to play first grade, not just next year, but for maybe the next 4 or 5 years behind Moses and Brown. That is modern rugby league, and you can't begrudge these guys wanting to play first grade. If I look at the Oloapu example, if he's going up to Redcliffe as reported, I mean, they do have some good players there, but there are definite opportunities. I mean, Isaiah Cattell is a good player, but then you've got other kind of utility players like Cody Nikarima or Sean O'Sullivan, and those are the guys he's competing with. It's a lot more likely that he's going to crack first grade there than he will potentially at Canterbury. So, I personally, so much of recruitment and retention, I really enjoyed your conversation with Mark O'Neill prior to Christmas, but so much of the recruitment and retention is around timing and planning, and there's so much that goes into it now. You just can't keep all these kids happy. Sometimes you've got to be agile, and I think you talked to Buckets about it in terms of you've got to keep a little bit of roster flexibility, so when an opportunity arises, you can take advantage of it. And sometimes that might mean you might have to make hard decisions, and there may be players that you'd ideally like to retain who have to leave the club because they are able to get a better deal elsewhere.
And really, that's what it came down to with Gutho and RCG. And it was the tough conversation. It was the tough decision, because if those two players hadn't departed, there's been some of the recent recruitment that we've done probably would not have happened. And during the season last year, when I was writing up about what was happening with our roster, and I said supporters had to brace themselves for the loss of some players that they didn't want to leave the club, because it was the only way that the club was going to be able to enter the player market. And, I think it's been refreshing this year to see the Eels go down the path of getting a lot of players on development contracts or train and trial deals who have many years in front of them, rather than players who are just, maybe they've got a career that's destined to be a fringe player at best, and they become, and it's a harsh word to use, but the stocking fillers at a club. I think it's far better to have players who have a bit more to offer than filling up a roster spot. And that's not meant as disrespect to players who've pulled on the jersey in lower grades for Parramatta at all, but it seems to be that the Eels have made a decision to go for some younger players in those positions of train and trial type deals. So, now we have to stick with the Bulldogs, because they released Eli Clark, who was a young centre on the rise, John, and I don't think it's come out yet where he's landing, but the club that he was rumoured to be landing at was the Parramatta Eels.
Yeah, and we spoke, obviously, pre-Eli Clark. We actually mentioned in a podcast with Quint last year how focused our recruitment has been coming out of Canterbury, right? Obviously, Josh Addo-Carr headlines that, but on top of that, you've got Gideon Katonga. You mentioned Eli Clark there, but Josh Papali'i, and then Jordan Samrani. So Eli Clark would be literally the cherry on top, wouldn't he, if he ends up landing here? And look, we spoke to Buckets, and on the record, he mentioned that the club is chasing an outside back. I imagine he meant in the context of NRL experience. So maybe Eli Clark is or isn't that guy. I think he comes on the cusp of being like an NRL player. So he might end up being the player that Buckets was talking about, or maybe he went more of an impact guy, like a guy that was competing in the first string. I don't know. But if he does sign at the Eels, it makes that cup team that much more complicated, mate. And I've been sort of chipping away at an article back to follow up my Team List Tuesday for the New Year's Eve that looked at the NRL to take a punt at the cup team, and goodness, it's tough. Because right now, depending on where you have Josh Papali'i playing, he could be fullback in cup, he could be playing NRL, and that gets that much more complicated in round 3 of the NRL when presumably Addo-Carr and Simonson are available. But you're looking at a backline in cup level. Before you add Clark, you got Jake Tungle, Sean Russell, Richard Penasini, Alf Miller-Stevens. Then you've got Ethan Martin, Hayes Dunster, You got a couple of young guys in Moe Alamadine and Ollie McCarthy who are going to be pushing for Cup this year. So it is crazy congested in the back line. That's not even talking about the forwards where it's every bit as packed. So really good problem to have. And I'd be very happy to take on someone like Eli Clark. But, yeah, making it fit is going to be very, very interesting for Nathan Kalis.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, Chris, it comes back to finding younger players that another club can't afford to keep.
Absolutely. And look, honestly, if I look at a lot of our signings this year, a lot of them have been players that maybe are underappreciated or have some extenuating circumstances like Josh Addo-Carr. And I feel like we've been able to get a lot of good young players who are undervalued at other clubs on really good contracts. If Iongi, for instance, as our starting fullback, becomes an above average fullback in the NRL, which is a big ask because fullback is probably the deepest position the game has. But let's just say, for argument's sake, he becomes a top half of the comp fullback. If you're paying him $300,000 or whatever he's earning, if you can get players like that contribute at a high level on a lower salary compared to some of their peers, then that's how you become a successful club. And that's why I'm excited about a lot of the signings we've made this year. So whether it be Eli Clark or others, Joash Papali is another one, or Papali, sorry. I did watch his video the other day explaining how to pronounce it, so I should have got that right. But any of these guys coming through, if we strike gold, then it's really exciting to see what we could become as a team this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, fellas, there is a little bit of extraordinary bad news for the Bulldogs because they're looking at developing a new centre of excellence at their Bulldogs, at their Belmore HQ. And John, as we'd expect in Western Sydney, that old horrible white matter was found.
Belmore, just the suburb over from where I am at. Not surprising that I think they're excavated into the Terry Lamb Hill. Terry Lamb, there you go. And they're found amidst a ton of other bad heavy metals, but asbestos. So that's going to not necessarily put the kibosh on the developments there, but they're going to have to obviously go through the proper protocols to get rid of the asbestos and all the nasty heavy metals. And when I was listening to the news report on 9 today, they pretty much had every heavy metal under the sun there, from lead to pretty much anything that wasn't uranium. And it was kind of an impressive long list there. So they're going to be derailed by that for a little bit, but you'd imagine they'll figure it out. It's just going to tack on some heavy costs because getting rid of that stuff is not cheap. It is not cheap and it's not simple. So it's going to put a dent in their timeline though, as well as their budget. So put some well behind schedule.
I'm just thinking now, when Belmore was redeveloped, did they change the way that the field ran? I'm talking about going well back, like maybe early 70s, late 60s or early 70s. Did that field run the other direction?
Before my time, so I'm trusting you on this. But again, it's the inner west of Sydney. There was a lot of industrial stuff happening out there. It's right next to the train lines as well. So it wouldn't shock me if there was, if it was known at one point that there was asbestos or asbestos-like material in the vicinity, and then sort of a lot of dirt was put there for a hill. I don't know.
Yeah, when I first went to that ground, there wasn't a grandstand there. It had the hill, and the other side was like a hill, but it was covered in asphalt. Where the grandstand is. So I'm just wondering whether they had a field that ran the other way, because certainly there is no room. Well, maybe there couldn't have been, because there isn't any room at the ends of the ground, is there? I mean, you're right on, as you say, you're right on the train line at one end, and you're right at the back of people's houses at the other end. So, yeah, but Chris, no surprise for asbestos being in an excavation in Western Sydney.
No, and look, I was at Belmore in round 3 of 2024. I think the Dogs played the Titans. I was back in Sydney for the weekend, and it didn't seem to stop the enthusiasm of the local punters as they were blaring out Baha men and jumping all over that hill. I think they won 32-0. So whatever's under the hill doesn't seem to be slowing down the fans anyway.
Well noted, mate. Well noted. Okay, now we'll give the Bulldogs a bit of a rest. There was a little bit of bad news floating around just at the end of last year. I think we missed this news with our final news podcast of the year, John, which is that it looks like the Cowboys have lost Helium Lukey.
Yeah, I can't remember if we touched on this when we spoke about them signing Bateman, but the timing was pretty close with overlap there, and it's a big loss. If I'm not sure we did talk about it, but if we didn't, this is a big loss for the Cowboys. Helium Lukey was not as highly fated as Nane, but he was really solid for the Cowboys and held down his edge on both sides of the ball really solidly. So that is a significant loss for them, and you always hate to see ACLs and the potential, it's not as big as it once was, but there can be some slowdown in a player sometimes and they don't respond as well, at least within the next 12 months, because we know it's always the season after your first season back that you tend to get back to your best. So he's going to be on a bit of a timeline there. And it sucks, yeah. You don't like seeing injuries like that, and to be robbed of a full season is just going to suck for young Helium there, and hopefully he makes a full recovery.
Yeah, and you hear of these sort of training mishaps that happen during pre-seasons, and Chris, I reckon for the players, these would be the injuries which hurts the most, because they're gearing up for a full season. They don't even get onto the field for 1 minute.
It's really unfortunate. You feel like if you're going to get hurt, you might as well do it in the heat of battle. But I think, we saw it last year, didn't we? I think Richard Penasini went down and Miller Stephen both went down, I think, in the preseason.
Mm-hmm.
It's really unfortunate for these guys. The Cowboys, not only Helium Lukey, but I think they also lost Tom Chester, who's a guy who's been absolutely cursed with injury over the past few years. And I think, ACL for him as well. So you never like to see it, and you just hope that these guys recover and they go on to having great careers. And
Chester was a player that was linked to Parramatta as well this year. He was a player we were looking to sign, I believe, in that utility spine role. So real sliding doors moment there for both player and club. And again, you wish him the best in a speedy recovery, because it just sucks. You want to see all these players, all these clubs at full strength to see the best contest possible and see these guys be able to, make their stories. And unfortunately, in the case of Chester and Lukey, that's not to be the case in 25.
Yeah, well, we wish them well with their rehab and recovery back to the playing fields. But fellas, we've got through it. The first news podcast of 2025. John, how'd we come in terms of time?
Bearing in mind that I was a little bit lavish with the the halftime song, sorry, it went for about a minute. We're at a minute 12 and a half as we record, so not too bad. Hour 12 and a half. Minute 12 and a half would be rapid. Rapid.
That would be. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, and we're out of here.
And we'll see you next week.
Like and subscribe. See you next week.
Yeah, and John, I don't know about you, but I thought Chris just had an outstanding debut on the podcast.
We put a bit of pressure on him in the green room and said, you got to make a good first impression, come off the back fences. But again, speaking to that strong bench rotation we got, he's done a killer job. Well done, mate.
Thanks, fellas. I've really enjoyed every minute of it. So I appreciate you having me on. It's been really, really enjoyable.
And we'll be keen on the feedback that we get as well with throughout this year. There might be some people who nominate themselves to come on and be part of the bench rotation. But Chris, we certainly would be hoping that we can get you back on in 2025 on other occasions. Of course, the determining factor is going to be the time differences between Australia and Austria. The countries sound very similar, but
it is currently 11 a.m. in Austria, so it's a bit of a time gap there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's manageable though. So if we feel the need, I can always usually swing something.
Well, mate, that sounds good, because I think you've been outstanding tonight, and people should look forward to the Off the Cumberland Fence series that will happen this year for people who've already read the articles in late 2024, you know the quality writer that Chris is. You've heard him speak, so you know that he's a very articulate man and knows his footy, certainly knows his jerseys, and at the very least, Chris's wife knows that Chris knows his jerseys.
Yes. She'll probably be listening to this at some point in the next few days as well. So I'll just, tell her I love her and hope that I stay married for a few more years, but no promises, no guarantees.
And of course, thank you to our listeners for joining us for this first podcast of 2025. Thank you to our sponsors, Star Partners Real Estate, Auburn, Narellan and Parramatta. A reminder about those junior reps programs that are reaching the pointy end of their pre-season and the trials that they've got happening this weekend out at Eric Tweedale Stadium. And, of course, a special mention there to Parramatta Leagues Club for their support of Junior Rugby League and their support of our coverage of Junior Rugby League. We really appreciate them getting behind us in what happens with the junior representative teams in our coverage. So lots of thank yous there. And as far as this particular podcast is concerned, that's a wrap. And as I always say, go you mighty Eels.